The runway lights glowed faintly against the desert night as Captain Aisha Khan tightened the straps of her G-suit, her fingers trembling not from fear but from the weight of what she had been ordered to do. The F-16 in front of her gleamed like a steel predator, its nose pointed toward the black horizon that carried with it the gravest threat her country had ever faced. Intelligence had confirmed that a rogue faction had seized control of a nuclear warhead deep inside a remote mountain base. If they managed to launch it, millions of innocent lives across the region would vanish in a single blinding instant. The only way to prevent it was to strike the facility before they could activate the weapon, but the base was shielded with layers of anti-air defenses, a fortress designed to repel even the most sophisticated strikes. The mission was classified as a one-way flight. No pilot was expected to come back alive. Aisha knew this, accepted it, and yet inside her heart something burned stronger than the fear of death, the refusal to let her homeland fall into darkness. She climbed into the cockpit, the familiar scent of metal, grease, and burnt fuel washing over her senses like a final embrace from an old companion. The canopy lowered with a hiss, sealing her in a world of switches, screens, and sheer responsibility. The tower's voice crackled in her headset, giving her clearance, and with a steady push of the throttle the F-16 roared to life, streaking down the runway like a lightning bolt unleashed. The G-forces pressed against her chest as she lifted into the night sky, leaving behind the base, her comrades, and perhaps life itself. Every second the jet climbed, her mind replayed images of her childhood, playing in the streets with her younger brother, her father's stern but proud smile when she was commissioned, her mother's soft prayers whispered under her breath whenever Aisha deployed. Those memories hardened her resolve. She was not just flying for her nation, she was flying for every family who deserved to live under a safe sky. As the F-16 cut through the stratosphere, Aisha switched to secure comms, receiving the last packet of intel. The warhead had been armed, countdown unknown. The compound was carved into the mountains with anti-aircraft batteries positioned in overlapping zones. Satellites had picked up mobile surface-to-air launchers on standby. Her mission profile was blunt: pierce the defenses, deliver the bunker-busting payload directly into the chamber, and accept the cost. Sweat trickled down her spine despite the cool flow of her oxygen mask. She adjusted her HUD, scanning the green arcs that marked radar sweeps. Already they were searching for her, like blind predators sniffing in the dark. She dropped altitude, skimming close to the mountain ridges, using the terrain to mask her radar signature. The silence of the night was broken only by the growl of the engine and her own heartbeat hammering inside her ears. A voice came over the channel, her wingman who had been ordered to turn back before the danger zone. "Eagle 1, may the wind be with you," he said, his tone thick with emotion. She responded with only 2 words, "For them." And then she was alone. The jagged mountains loomed like sentinels, shadows hiding death in every valley. Suddenly, alarms shrieked in her cockpit, enemy radar lock. Her training kicked in and she rolled hard to the left, releasing chaff and flares as streaks of fire cut through the darkness. Missiles arced across the sky, exploding in blossoms of white heat behind her. The jet shuddered but held, its wings slicing the air like a blade of vengeance. She pushed lower, the ground rushing beneath her at impossible speeds, her eyes locked on the coordinates that would lead her straight into the lion's den. Another lock, another barrage, she weaved between cliffs, pulling maneuvers that tested the very limits of the F-16's frame. Her body screamed under the crushing G-forces, but her spirit refused to yield. For a fleeting second, she thought of ejecting, of surviving, but the thought was obliterated by the vision of what would happen if she failed. A mushroom cloud rising, cities erased, children's laughter silenced forever. Death was acceptable, failure was not. With one hand gripping the stick and the other hovering over the weapon's release, Aisha whispered a silent prayer, not for her safety but for her accuracy. The compound finally appeared on her HUD, a cluster of steel and concrete dug into the mountain's heart, glowing with heat signatures that betrayed frantic movement. She knew they were preparing, perhaps already seconds away from launching destruction. Her jaw clenched as she armed the payload, guiding the crosshairs over the target. But even as she closed in, the skies erupted, dozens of tracers and missiles launching from hidden emplacements, the air becoming a storm of fire meant to shred her apart. Her cockpit lit up with warnings, panels flashing red, systems screaming at her to retreat. Instead, she pushed the throttle to the maximum, the engine roaring as if sharing her defiance. The world narrowed to a tunnel, her eyes locked on that single point in the mountain where history would either end or begin again. A hit slammed into her right wing, the jet lurching violently, alarms wailing. Pain flared through her body as the G-forces threw her against the straps, but she gritted her teeth, forcing the jet to stay steady. The target loomed larger, the moment closing in. With a deep breath that carried every memory, every promise, every heartbeat of her nation, she pressed the release. The bomb detached, slicing through the air toward the bunker. Aisha held the jet steady, even as flames engulfed her right side, refusing to turn away, refusing to look back. And in that suspended second, as steel and fire collided with destiny, she knew this was the moment where her life ended and her country's survival began. The explosion shook the mountains like the wrath of the earth itself, a blinding inferno erupting from the compound as her bomb pierced deep into the heart of the bunker. For a heartbeat the night turned into day, and Aisha's cockpit was filled with fire and smoke, the shockwave slamming into her F-16 like a giant's fist. The jet spun out of control, alarms shrieking as flames tore across her damaged wing. Her vision blurred, her body pressed violently against the harness as she fought the stick with every ounce of strength left in her arms. She had done it, she had hit the target, but survival was slipping away as fast as her altitude. The jet spiraled toward the jagged rocks below, the ground rushing closer, and for the first time she considered pulling the ejection handle. But the canopy was cracked, the systems compromised, and she knew the enemy still had anti-air batteries sweeping the skies. Ejecting might mean parachuting straight into their grasp, a prisoner who had failed to finish the mission. She bit down on her lip hard enough to taste blood and forced herself to regain control. Smoke filled the cockpit, acrid and suffocating, her lungs burning as she gasped for air through the mask. The right wing was gone, torn apart by the missile, and the F-16 was crippled. But somehow, by sheer will and instinct, she leveled the aircraft just enough to avoid the first mountain ridge. Her hands moved in a blur across the controls, shutting down damaged systems, rerouting power, fighting to keep the beast alive. Sparks showered from the panels, the engine coughed, and for a moment it seemed the jet would tear itself apart, but then it steadied, wobbling, bleeding altitude but still airborne. She had no idea how long it would hold. Her radar showed chaos below. The compound obliterated, secondary explosions ripping through hidden stockpiles of ammunition, fuel, and perhaps even secondary devices. The nuclear warhead was gone, vaporized in the firestorm, and with it the nightmare that could have ended millions of lives. Relief surged through her, but it was swallowed quickly by the pain in her ribs, the blood seeping from a cut across her forehead, and the realization that she was still deep in enemy territory. Her comms crackled with static, faint voices calling her code name, asking if she was alive. She tried to respond but her transmitter was broken, leaving her trapped in silence. She was a ghost in the night sky, flying a dying machine with no way to call for help. Another barrage of tracers streaked upward as ground forces fired blindly into the sky, desperate to shoot down the intruder. She dropped altitude again, skimming dangerously close to the mountainside, using the terrain to shield herself. The F-16 shuddered, the engine whining, and warning lights continued to flash across her panel, but she refused to surrender. If the jet fell, she would take it down fighting, not drifting helplessly into their hands. Her thoughts returned to her family, her brother who dreamed of becoming a doctor, her parents who had given everything to see her rise through the ranks in a world that doubted her. She thought of the cadets she had trained, the young women who looked at her as proof that courage had no gender. She could not let her story end here, not in silence, not in captivity. Another mountain loomed ahead, its dark outline blocking the stars. She yanked the stick hard, the F-16 groaning as it climbed, pieces of metal rattling loose, the sound of death raking against the fuselage. She cleared the ridge by meters, her breath catching as sparks trailed behind her like a comet breaking apart. She whispered to herself, a vow that even if the jet gave out, she would find a way to survive. The sky stretched endlessly, but her gauges told the truth. Fuel was leaking, hydraulics failing, controls weakening. She had minutes at best. The only hope was to find a flat stretch where she could attempt an emergency landing. Her eyes scanned the terrain, the mountains giving way to a narrow valley, shadowed and treacherous, but it was her only chance. She angled the nose downward, fighting the jet's resistance, coaxing it toward the valley floor. Her teeth clenched as the ground rushed up, her entire body screaming from the pressure, but she held steady, guiding the crippled F-16 as if it were a wounded bird begging to rest. The landing was brutal. The jet slammed against the rocky ground, skidding violently, sparks exploding as the fuselage scraped across stone. The canopy cracked further, shards of glass raining across her helmet, the world spinning in chaos. She braced, muscles tearing, bones rattling, until finally the wreckage screeched to a halt, smoke and fire billowing from what was once a machine of the skies. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of leaking fuel and the distant echo of explosions still reverberating from the destroyed base. Aisha's body hung limp in the harness, pain radiating through every limb, but she was alive. With trembling hands she unbuckled, pushing against the warped canopy until it finally gave way. Cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of dust, fire, and freedom. She crawled out of the wreckage, her legs barely obeying, collapsing onto the dirt. Above her the stars burned brightly, indifferent to her struggle, and she realized that somehow she had survived the impossible. The mission was complete, the warhead destroyed, but now a new battle awaited. Survival behind enemy lines with hostile forces surely converging on the crash site. She staggered to her feet, each step agony, her vision swimming, but she forced herself onward, away from the wreck, deeper into the shadows of the valley. Her journey was far from over, it had only begun. The valley was silent except for the rasp of her breath and the crunch of gravel under her boots as Aisha forced herself forward, each step tearing at muscles already bruised and bloodied from the crash. Her ribs felt cracked, a sharp pain stabbing with every inhale, and her right arm throbbed from the impact with the harness, but she pushed the pain aside. She had learned long ago in training that pain was a signal, not a command, and she would not let her body dictate surrender when her mission was still unfinished. Destroying the warhead had saved her country, but survival now meant keeping her knowledge and her presence hidden from those who would torture it out of her. The enemy would be searching, and if they found her alive, she would become their prize. The mountains loomed around her like jagged teeth, shadows stretching long beneath the faint moonlight, and she kept to the darkest edges, moving with the caution of a hunted animal. Every few moments she glanced back, expecting to see the glow of headlights or the bobbing of flashlights sweeping the valley floor. Her ears strained for the whine of engines or the bark of radios, but only the distant rumble of aftershocks from the destroyed bunker answered. She remembered her survival training, the endless drills in the desert where instructors pushed cadets to the brink, teaching them how to disappear, how to make the earth itself a shield. The memory steadied her. She dropped to her knees, crawling toward a cluster of rocks that offered concealment, her palms scraping raw against the ground. The cold bit into her skin, but she welcomed it. It meant her body was still alive, still fighting. She slid between the rocks and pressed herself flat, listening. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. It was impossible to measure time in the endless dark, but soon she caught it, the sound of engines in the distance growing louder. She peered over the stones and saw vehicles snaking into the valley, headlights cutting sharp beams through the night. Soldiers dismounted, their voices carried faintly by the wind, shouting orders in clipped tones. They were spreading out, searching the terrain methodically. They knew a pilot had survived the crash and they meant to find her. Her pulse quickened, but fear did not paralyze her, it sharpened her thoughts. She checked her flight suit, reaching into the emergency survival kit strapped to her thigh. Inside was a combat knife, a flare gun, a small ration pack, a map printed on waterproof cloth, and a radio beacon meant for rescue operations. The beacon tempted her like salvation, but she dared not activate it now. Its signal would call not only allies but enemies, and in these mountains the enemies were far closer. She tucked it back, drew the knife, and steadied her breathing. The soldiers were closing in, their flashlights sweeping dangerously near her position. She could see their silhouettes now, rifles slung, boots crunching on the same ground she had just crossed. She pressed herself lower, her heartbeat pounding so loud she feared it would betray her. One soldier's light passed within meters of her hiding place, pausing on the rocks as if sensing something. Aisha held her breath until her lungs burned, gripping the knife tighter, ready to strike if discovered. Then the beam moved on and the soldier rejoined his unit. Relief washed over her, but she did not linger. Staying put meant eventual capture. She waited until their formation pushed farther down the valley, then crawled in the opposite direction, each movement slow and deliberate, merging with the shadows. She reached a dry streambed and slid into it, using its natural depression as cover, moving silently along its winding course. The walls of the streambed rose above her shoulders, hiding her from sight but also trapping her in a narrow corridor. Every sound she made echoed, and she moved with the careful silence of prey. Her thoughts drifted to the maps she had studied before the mission. Somewhere beyond these mountains lay the border, and if she could reach Allied territory, there might be a chance of extraction. But between her and safety stretched miles of hostile terrain and relentless pursuers. Her body screamed for rest, her wounds dragging her toward collapse, but she clenched her teeth and pressed on. Fatigue was a luxury she could not afford. Hours passed until her legs trembled from exhaustion, and finally she allowed herself to sink against the cold wall of the streambed. The stars above glittered faintly, watching without mercy. She pulled a ration bar from her kit, chewing slowly, forcing herself to take in every calorie. Water was scarce, and she knew she had to find a source soon or risk collapse. As she ate, she thought of the lives she had saved, the children in schools, the families in cities, people who would never know her name or what she had done. That thought was enough to rekindle her strength. But her reprieve ended when distant voices echoed down the valley once more. The soldiers had widened their search, sweeping the area with dogs now, their barks cutting through the night. Her heart tightened. Dogs meant her scent could betray her no matter how carefully she hid. She rose unsteadily, forcing her legs to move, following the stream bed until it split into a narrow ravine. She scrambled upward, clawing at the rocks, her fingers raw and bleeding, pulling herself higher and higher until she reached a ledge overlooking the valley. From here she saw them clearly, dozens of soldiers fanning out, flashlights slicing the dark, dogs straining at their leashes. She pressed flat against the rock, forcing herself to be still, praying the wind would carry her scent away. One of the dogs barked furiously, tugging toward the rocks below her perch. A soldier followed, scanning with his light, the beam inching dangerously close. Aisha's grip tightened on her knife, her entire body coiled for the possibility of a fight she could not win but would not run from. The soldier's flashlight crept higher, sliding along the jagged rocks until the beam hovered just below her ledge, the dog barking wildly, claws scraping at stone as if it could rip through the mountain to reach her. Aisha pressed her body flat, her chest barely rising as she fought to keep her breathing silent. Sweat trickled down her face despite the cold, stinging her eyes, but she dared not move to wipe it away. The soldier shouted something to his comrade, his voice sharp and impatient, and for a terrifying moment she thought he would climb up and discover her. Her fingers tightened on the knife until her knuckles whitened, her mind already racing through how she might strike, how she could kill quickly and silently before the others noticed. But the soldier tugged hard at the leash, dragging the dog back, muttering curses. The animal resisted, barking and straining, but finally it was pulled away. The beam of light vanished, and Aisha was left in darkness once more, her muscles trembling from the effort of staying completely still. She released a slow breath, every nerve in her body sparking with adrenaline. She could not stay here, they would return and the dogs would not give up forever. She waited until their lights faded farther down the valley, then pushed herself away from the ledge, climbing higher up the slope. The climb was brutal. Loose rocks slid under her boots, her wounds tore open with every movement, and blood trickled down her arm, but she refused to stop. She thought of her father's words from years ago, when she first told him she wanted to fly. Courage is not the absence of fear, Aisha. It is moving forward even when fear holds you by the throat. Tonight those words lived inside her like fire. Higher and higher she climbed until she reached the crest of the ridge. From there she could see far across the mountains, the faint glow of fire still smoldering from the destroyed bunker, and in the opposite direction, the long dark expanse of wilderness that stretched toward the border. It was a cruel distance, filled with danger, but it was also her only path to freedom. She limped onward, keeping to the shadows, ears straining for every sound. Hours blended together, exhaustion gnawing at her mind, but she refused to collapse. The moon sank, the first gray streaks of dawn breaking over the horizon, and with the light came new risk. Darkness had been her ally, daylight would expose her. She searched desperately for shelter, scanning the cliffs and valleys until she spotted what looked like a narrow cave opening hidden behind a tangle of brush. She dragged herself toward it, crawling inside, the cool damp air wrapping around her like a shield. Inside, the cave opened into a shallow chamber, barely enough to sit, but it was safety for now. She collapsed against the stone wall, her body screaming in pain, and allowed herself a moment of rest. Her eyelids fluttered, heavy with exhaustion, but she fought to stay awake. Sleep meant vulnerability and she could not afford that. Instead she focused on her survival kit, pulling out the cloth map. By the markings, she estimated she was still 50 kilometers from the border, perhaps more depending on terrain. Without radio contact, she was on her own, but she clung to the hope that Allied forces would be searching for her. She only had to survive long enough for them to reach her, or to reach them herself. Her thoughts drifted to the blast she had caused, the inferno that had consumed the warhead. She imagined the chain reaction, the shock waves echoing through command centers across the world, leaders realizing how close disaster had come and how one pilot had stopped it. But those leaders would never know what she endured here in the shadows, hunted and alone. That truth belonged only to her, carved into her bones by every step she took. A sudden noise jolted her from her thoughts, the crunch of boots outside the cave. Her heart slammed in her chest as she froze, clutching the knife. Voices followed, muffled but close, soldiers speaking in urgent tones. The dogs barked again, closer than before. She had been tracked. Her mind raced, searching for an escape. The cave had no second exit, no deeper chamber to hide in. If they entered, she would be trapped. She considered firing the flare gun into the narrow opening, using the burst of light and heat to blind and scare them, but it would also give away her exact position. She pressed her back against the stone, every muscle taut, listening as footsteps drew nearer. A shadow fell across the cave entrance, and a beam of light pierced inside, sweeping across the floor until it stopped on her blood trail. She knew the next second would decide everything. With a surge of raw instinct, she fired the flare. The cave erupted in blinding red. Light, heat filling the air as the projectile shot straight into the soldier's face. He cried out, stumbling backward, clutching at his eyes. Chaos exploded outside as the dog barked madly and the other soldiers shouted in confusion. Aisha used the moment, bursting from the cave like a shadow of fire, knife in hand. She lunged at the nearest soldier, striking fast, silencing him before he could react. The others turned, rifles swinging, but she was already gone, sprinting into the jagged rocks, her lungs burning, every step a scream of agony. Bullets ripped through the air, stone chips spraying around her, but she did not stop. She zigzagged through the terrain, diving behind a boulder, then crawling, then running again. The soldiers shouted, their lights scattering across the mountainside, but she melted into the shadows, every ounce of her being focused on escape. When at last the gunfire ceased and the voices grew distant, she collapsed against the rocks, chest heaving, knife slick with blood, her body trembling not with fear but with the savage will to live. She had been found once, and she knew they would find her again. The hunt was far from over, but she also knew something else now. She could fight back, she could endure, and as long as she drew breath, she would not let them claim victory. Her body felt like it was made of broken glass as she leaned against the boulder, her chest rising and falling in jagged gasps, but her mind refused to let her collapse. She knew the soldiers would regroup, the dogs would find her scent again, and this chase would not end until either she crossed the border or they dragged her body back. She forced herself to stand, every joint stiff, her legs quivering under her weight, but determination pushed her onward. The sky was turning pale, the sun creeping over the mountains, washing the terrain with light that exposed every ridge, every shadow, and every possible hiding place. Daylight was her enemy now. She moved quickly, climbing higher into the rocks where the terrain was more treacherous, knowing vehicles could not follow. Her knife was still slick with blood, and though she told herself it was survival, not vengeance, the memory of the soldier's face before she struck haunted her. She pushed it away. Survival was not about morality, it was about endurance. She pulled the cloth map again, her fingers trembling, and studied it carefully. A narrow pass about 30 kilometers away could lead her toward Allied territory. It was a hard trek, but it offered cover and natural choke points. If she could reach it, she might hold them off long enough to disappear into the wilderness. She tucked the map away and began moving, keeping low, her eyes always scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. Hours dragged by under the relentless sun, her throat parched, lips cracked, each step a war against her body. She rationed her water, sipping only enough to keep her mouth wet, but she knew it would not last. Hunger gnawed at her, but the thought of food was drowned by the constant awareness of danger. Then she heard it, the faint echo of voices carried by the wind. They were behind her again, closer than before, the dogs baying. Her chest tightened. She had to change the game. Running endlessly would only end with her collapse. If she wanted to survive, she had to strike first, to bleed them enough to slow their pursuit. She scanned the terrain, her eyes locking on a narrow section of the ridge where the path funneled into a tight corridor between two cliffs. It was perfect for an ambush. She dragged herself upward, moving quickly despite her exhaustion, and found a position above the choke point. From here she could see the valley below, the soldiers moving in formation, rifles ready, the dogs straining as they caught her scent. She pulled the flare gun from her kit, the second and last round still loaded. She waited, every muscle tense, the heat of the sun pressing down on her. When the first soldiers entered the corridor, she aimed not at them but at the rocky overhang above. With a sharp pull of the trigger, the flare shot upward, slamming into the stone with a burst of fire. The weakened rock gave way, an avalanche of boulders crashing down, engulfing the soldiers below. Screams echoed through the valley as dust and debris filled the air, the formation scattering in chaos. Aisha did not wait to admire the result. She slid down the opposite side of the ridge, moving quickly, putting as much distance between herself and the survivors as possible. Her heart pounded, adrenaline masking the pain in her body. She knew she had bought herself time, maybe hours, but not safety. They would regroup and they would be furious. She pushed herself harder, weaving through gullies, climbing ridges, until the sun dipped lower and shadows stretched long across the mountains. As darkness approached, she found another cave, smaller than the first, half hidden by thorny bushes. She crawled inside, wincing as the sharp branches tore at her suit, but once inside she felt a measure of relief. She lit nothing, ate nothing, only drank a sip of water and lay flat against the stone, listening to the night. The mountains were alive with sound, owls calling, insects chirping, the distant rumble of engines. She knew they were still searching, fanning out, hunting her like predators. Her body trembled from exhaustion, but her mind remained sharp, replaying the map in her head, marking the path she must take. She thought again of her family, of her mother's prayers and her brother's laughter, of the countless lives she had saved by stopping the warhead. That thought anchored her, kept her from drowning in despair. Sleep crept in despite her will, pulling her into restless dreams of fire and falling, of the explosion that still echoed in her ears. When she woke, the sun was already rising again, the cave unbearably hot. She crawled out, blinking against the glare, and checked her compass. The pass was still far, but she had no choice but to keep moving. Her legs felt like lead, her lips cracked, her body bruised and bleeding, but when she stepped forward, she found strength in the rhythm of survival itself. She descended into another valley, scanning constantly, her instincts prickling with unease. She paused near a cluster of rocks, crouching low, and that was when she saw them, 3 soldiers moving ahead of her, not behind. They had outflanked her. Panic flared, but she smothered it quickly. Running would draw their eyes, hiding might by seconds. She slid behind a rock, pressing herself into the shadow, gripping the knife. The soldiers moved slowly, scanning, rifles ready, their faces grim. She held her breath, her hands steady despite the storm inside her chest. If they spotted her, it would be fight or die. And in that still moment, crouched in the dust and shadows, she understood something with clarity so sharp it cut through the fear. She was no longer only fleeing. She was a soldier still on mission, and mission meant victory, not surrender. The 3 soldiers drew closer, their boots crunching softly on the gravel, their rifles sweeping the rocks as they advanced. Aisha's pulse hammered in her ears, but her hand did not shake. She had spent years training for combat, and though her body was battered and torn, her instincts remained sharp. She crouched lower, waiting for the moment when one of them would step just close enough. The first soldier passed within meters of her hiding place, his eyes fixed on the horizon, unaware of the shadow waiting behind the stone. Aisha exploded from the darkness, knife flashing in a swift arc that found the gap beneath his helmet. He fell without a sound, his weapon clattering softly to the ground. The others spun instantly, shouting, rifles raising, but Aisha was already moving. She snatched up the fallen rifle, diving behind another rock as bullets tore through the space she had just occupied. Dust and stones splintered around her, the noise deafening, but adrenaline carried her through. She aimed quickly, squeezing off controlled bursts. One soldier cried out, spinning as a round clipped his shoulder, but the other pressed forward, firing steadily, pinning her down. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, acrid and suffocating. She forced herself to stay calm, to breathe, to wait for her moment. The wounded soldier dragged his comrade into cover, shouting orders, their voices tight with determination. They were trained, disciplined, not easily shaken. But Aisha had the advantage of desperation, of knowing she had nothing to lose. She tossed a stone to her left, the clatter echoing, and as one soldier turned his rifle toward the noise, she lunged from the opposite side, firing in short bursts. The bullets found their mark and the soldier collapsed. The last man shouted in rage, firing wildly, but she kept low, rolling across the ground until she came up behind him. The knife struck again, fast and merciless, and then there was silence. Her chest heaved, her arms trembling, the rifle slipping from her grasp as the weight of what she had done settled over her. 3 more lives ended by her hand, and though survival demanded it, her soul recoiled. She pressed her forehead to the ground, whispering a prayer for strength, not forgiveness. Forgiveness was a luxury she could not afford. She searched the bodies quickly, finding extra ammunition, a canteen half filled with water, and a small radio clipped to one of their belts. She hesitated before taking it, knowing the risk. The radio could reveal her position if she transmitted, but it could also allow her to listen, to learn their movements. She clipped it to her gear, slipping back into the shadows. The sun climbed higher, heat beating down mercilessly, and she forced herself onward, every step heavier than the last. The water from the canteen revived her, but it was not enough. Her ribs burned with every breath, her legs screamed, but she kept moving. Hours passed until she stumbled upon a ridge that overlooked a wider valley, and from there she saw it. The pass, distant but real, the jagged cut in the mountains that marked her path to freedom. Relief surged through her, but it was tempered by the sight of soldiers already sweeping the valley below. They had predicted her route, blocking her way forward. Her jaw clenched. She could not go back, they would be behind her as well. The only path was through. She slid down the ridge, keeping low, weaving between boulders, her eyes locked on the enemy patrols. There were too many to fight directly. She needed to outthink them, to strike like a shadow and vanish before they could react. She waited until dusk fell, the sky painted with streaks of red and gold, and then she began her descent into the valley. She moved silently, using every trick her training had taught her, staying downwind from the dogs, timing her steps with the wind, freezing whenever a light swept near. Twice she came within meters of patrols, holding her breath until they passed, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might give her away. She pressed onward, every sense heightened, until at last she reached the narrow base of the valley. But as she crawled between two boulders, a beam of light struck her squarely. Shouts erupted, rifles raised, and she knew she had been spotted. Bullets snapped through the air, stone chips stinging her face as she dove behind cover, returning fire with the stolen rifle. The valley erupted into chaos, voices shouting, gunfire echoing, dogs barking madly. She ran low, firing in short bursts, using the terrain to shield herself. A grenade landed nearby, the blast throwing her to the ground, her ears ringing, body racked with pain. She scrambled to her feet, staggering, firing blindly as she retreated into the rocks. The soldiers pressed forward, relentless, their numbers overwhelming. She ducked into a crevice, heart racing, and clutched the radio. Static hissed, then a voice crackled through, urgent and sharp, issuing orders in their tongue. She listened, piecing together their strategy. They were closing the valley from both ends, trapping her in a net. Despair clawed at her chest, but she forced it down. She was a pilot, a soldier, a survivor, and surrender was not in her blood. She checked the last magazine of ammunition, slid it into the rifle, and whispered to herself, "One more fight." Then she broke from the crevice, firing as she ran, a lone figure against the tide, determined to carve her way through no matter the cost. The valley roared with gunfire as Aisha sprinted between rocks, each step a battle against exhaustion and pain. Bullets hissed past her ears, striking the stone with sharp cracks, sending shards into her skin. The radio at her side crackled with frantic commands as the soldiers closed in, their voices overlapping in a storm of urgency. Her lungs burned, her ribs screamed, but she kept moving, pushing her battered body forward with sheer willpower. She dove into a shallow trench, slamming her shoulder against the earth, her rifle rattling in her grip. She peeked out just long enough to fire 3 shots, dropping one soldier, sending the others scrambling for cover. Her magazine clicked empty, and she cursed under her breath, slamming the last one into place. She was running out of everything: ammo, energy, blood. Yet even cornered, she refused to die quietly. The sun had slipped behind the mountains and twilight cloaked the valley in shadow, giving her a sliver of hope. She crawled along the trench, dragging herself deeper into the rocks. The soldiers advanced cautiously now, their discipline restraining their rage. They wanted her alive if possible. She could hear it in the way they shouted to hold fire, to tighten the net. She knew why. A downed pilot with her rank and knowledge was a prize too valuable to waste. But capture was worse than death. Capture meant betrayal of everything she had fought to protect. She whispered her father's name, her mother's, her brother's, letting their memory burn away the fear. If this valley became her grave, it would not be one of surrender. She reached a boulder split into 2 jagged halves and slipped between them, finding a small hollow just large enough to conceal her. From there she could see the soldiers forming a line, moving with precision, flashlights slicing through the dark. She waited, heart thundering, breath shallow, her finger poised on the trigger. One soldier drew too close, his light sweeping over the rocks. Aisha fired once, the shot echoing like thunder in the night. He fell instantly, his cry cutting short. Chaos erupted as the others fired wildly, their muzzle flashes lighting the darkness in rapid bursts. She shifted positions, firing again, then again, weaving shadows and gunfire together until the valley itself seemed alive with battle. Yet with every shot, her ammo dwindled, her survival thinning like smoke in the wind. A flare hissed into the sky, bathing the valley in harsh white light, exposing her position. She scrambled, rolling out from the hollow, bullets slicing past her heels as she darted toward a ridge. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her body screaming in protest, but she forced her legs to carry her. She slipped once, tumbling down the slope, her palms scraping raw against the rocks, but she pushed up, staggering onward. Voices rose behind her, closer now, the hunt reaching its end. She reached the ridge and pressed her back to the stone, her rifle heavy in her hands. She closed her eyes briefly, summoning the last of her courage. This was it. Her final stand. She opened her eyes and lifted the rifle, ready to meet them head-on. But before she could fire, a distant thunder rolled through the valley. At first she thought it was her mind breaking under the strain, but then the sound grew clearer, rotor blades cutting through the night air. Helicopters. She froze, disbelief coursing through her. The soldiers turned too, their voices rising in alarm as spotlights slashed down from above. Allied rescue forces had arrived. Hope, sharp and blinding, surged in her chest. The first helicopter swept low, its guns spitting fire, tearing through the enemy lines. Soldiers scattered, some diving for cover, others cut down instantly. Explosions shook the ground as rockets struck armored vehicles hidden at the edges of the valley. The sky itself seemed to roar with vengeance. Aisha dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. Against every odd, she had survived long enough for them to reach her. But the battle was far from over. The soldiers, disciplined and desperate, regrouped, firing RPGs at the helicopters, their trail streaking across the sky. One rocket struck, the explosion ripping through the night, sending a chopper spinning into the mountainside. Flames erupted, screams carrying on the wind, and Aisha's heart clenched. Rescue had come, but at a terrible cost. She forced herself back to her feet, gripping the rifle tighter, adding her fire to the chaos. Each shot she took now was not just survival, it was vengeance for the men who had come for her, for the ones still fighting above. A voice crackled through the radio again, but this time it was not the enemy. Falcon 1, this is Guardian. We have your beacon. Hold your ground. We're coming. Her throat tightened as she realized they had found her signal. She pressed the transmit button, whispering with what little strength she had left, Guardian, I'm here. I'm not done yet. Gunfire rattled around her, explosions tearing through the valley, but for the first time since she fell from the sky, she felt something more powerful than fear. She felt certainty. She was going to make it out alive, or die fighting with her allies beside her. The valley was burning, alive with fire and chaos as the helicopters circled above, their blades thundering through the night. Aisha pressed herself flat against the rocks, firing at anything that moved while smoke and dust swallowed the stars. She could feel her body trembling with exhaustion, her arms barely able to lift the rifle, but her spirit was unbroken. Every bullet she sent into the darkness carried her refusal to die a prisoner. The enemy surged again, determined to overwhelm the rescue force before they could reach her. Their shouts echoed through the valley, commands sharp and merciless, the sound of boots pounding against rock closing in from every side. She gritted her teeth and fought harder, shifting from cover to cover, her body screaming in pain. Above her, a spotlight cut through the haze, locking onto her position, a voice booming from the helicopter loudspeaker. Hold on, Falcon 1, we see you. Relief surged, but it was fleeting because in the same instant an enemy rocket launcher emerged from the ridgeline, its warhead aimed directly at the aircraft. Time slowed as Aisha realized what was about to happen. If that missile struck, her rescuers would be slaughtered, the mission doomed, and her survival worthless. She didn't think, she acted. Ignoring the agony in her ribs, she pushed herself upright and sprinted toward the ridgeline, the world exploding around her as bullets chased her every step. She climbed with desperate strength, rocks cutting into her palms, her boots slipping on loose gravel, but she refused to stop. The soldier with the launcher locked onto the helicopter, finger tightening on the trigger, when Aisha hurled herself over the last rise. She tackled him with a roar, the two of them tumbling across the rocks, the weapon clattering to the ground. They struggled violently, his knife flashing in the moonlight, slashing across her arm, hot blood spilling down her sleeve. She ignored the pain, ramming her elbow into his throat, seizing the launcher with her free hand. With the last of her strength, she swung it like a club, striking him across the skull, dropping him lifeless against the stone. She staggered, panting, gripping the launcher with trembling hands. Then she looked up and saw the helicopter hovering, waiting, its rope ladder dangling through the smoke. Her heart thundered. Freedom was there. Rescue was there. But behind her, more soldiers were rising from the shadows, their rifles raised. She turned and fired wildly, buying herself seconds, then seconds more, each step toward the ladder a battle. Bullets tore into the ground around her, sparks flying as metal struck stone, one grazing across her shoulder and spinning her sideways. She screamed but forced herself onward, leaping for the ladder just as her legs gave out. Her hands caught the rungs, her body swinging in the night air as the helicopter lifted. Gunfire shredded the ground below, the soldiers raging at her escape, but she clung on, her knuckles white, teeth clenched against the howl of the wind. A crewman leaned out, shouting, reaching down to grab her wrist. With a final pull, they dragged her inside, her body collapsing onto the floor of the aircraft. She lay there gasping, her chest heaving, the cabin shaking with the thunder of gunfire outside. "We've got her. Falcon 1 is secure," the crewman shouted into his headset. The words echoed through her, stronger than any medicine. She was safe. For the first time since the mission began, she allowed herself to close her eyes and weep, not for her own suffering, but for the comrades who had fought to bring her home, and for the miracle of survival. Yet even in safety she knew it was not over. Through the open side door she could see the valley receding below, still burning, enemy forces scattering under the relentless assault of the remaining helicopters. Her mission had succeeded. The nuclear convoy had been destroyed, the threat averted. The cost had been unimaginable, but millions of lives were saved. She turned her face to the stars, their cold light piercing through the haze, and whispered a promise to herself. Never again would she doubt her purpose. She had walked through fire, through blood, through death itself, and still she lived. She had proven that courage was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear decide her fate. The crew wrapped her wounds, speaking gently, their eyes filled with respect. To them she was more than a pilot. She was a warrior who had given everything. As the helicopter crossed the border and the familiar lights of home shimmered in the distance, Aisha breathed deeply, the air tasting of hope and iron. She thought of her family, of her nation, of the countless souls who would never know how close the world had come to ruin, and she smiled through her tears. She had been sent on a one-way mission, expected to sacrifice her life to stop catastrophe. Yet against all odds she had returned. Broken, scarred but alive. And that survival was its own kind of victory. The helicopter touched down at a secure base, medics rushing forward, floodlights glaring as the crew carried her out. She lifted her head one last time to look at the dark sky, the fading smoke on the horizon. She had survived the impossible. And though nightmares would haunt her, though scars would mark her forever, she knew she had done what few could ever imagine. She had changed the course of history with nothing but courage, faith, and a will that refused to yield. The end.